Hey, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Shorelink Libraries and our bookshop partners, welcome to this online edition of our Author Talk program. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to the ancestors and spirits past and present. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respect to any Aboriginal persons joining us today. My name is Kate Stewart and I'm part of the library team here at Stanton Library in North Sydney Council. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Ian Hoskins to talk about his book, Australia and the Pacific, A History, in which he examines Australia's relationship with the Pacific region and questions what our responsibilities towards our increasingly imperiled neighbours might be. Ian has worked as an academic and public historian in Sydney for many years. He's taught at universities, worked as a curator at the Powerhouse Museum, and since 2003, written, curated and guided walks in his capacity as the North Sydney Council historian. On weekends, he researches and writes as an independent historian. Thank you and welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks, everyone, for coming or for staying one way or another. And yes, so this book emerged out of some earlier work that I'd done, all of it while here at North Sydney Council, and all of it in some way or other sort of emerging from work at North Sydney Council. The first was a history of Sydney Harbour, and the second major work was a history of the New South Wales coast. And in both of those, I became aware of our close relationship with the Pacific, unsurprisingly, and was surprised at how few books address that as a large topic. There are many really excellent books, and I've drawn on those, and I've noted those in my own work on specific aspects of Australia's relationship with the Pacific, whether it be foreign policy, most obviously with the Second World War and the war in the Pacific, in New Guinea particularly. Other books dealing with early traders, colonial traders heading off to Tahiti for pork. I'll say a bit more about that as we move along today. And sandalwood, really fascinating. A guy called D.R. Hainsworth just wrote the most wonderful book called Sydney Traders, which I couldn't have done without. So there are real treasures like that, but there was no big book. So spying that gap in the market, I thought maybe I'll do it. And one of the things that I also noted as I was writing and researching was how often it was commented upon that Australians, and I think by that term is meant white Australians, how little at the moment they understand the history of the relationship of this country with the Pacific, or its present relationship with the Pacific. Sean Dorney, who would be known to some of you, if not all, as the former ABC correspondent for many, many, many years in the Pacific, based in New Guinea, he has most recently made comments like that, and it's obviously a bit demoralised about how apparently little Australia understands and how few foreign correspondents are currently located in the Pacific. The ABC still has a journalist in New Guinea, but it used to be that the major newspapers all had permanent correspondents there, and that's no longer the case. So I was aware of that, and the question then is whether there's a current amnesia, so we've forgotten what we once all knew, or whether that distant relationship or that ambiguous relationship was there from the get-go. And it's a little of both, to be honest. But I've got to say that in the past, there have been particular moments where Australia's relationship with the Pacific had been really present in many people's minds, at least on the Pacific coast. That's the east coast of Australia. And here is, you can see this picture of the grave of Commodore Goodenough up at St Thomas's Rest Park. I mean, it's only less than a kilometre from where I'm sitting in Stanton Library at the moment. So I got to have a think about this also in my capacity as the North Sydney Council historian. When I researched that or read about it, other people had researched it already, I became aware that when Commodore Goodenough, James Goodenough, who was the head of the Royal Navy flotilla in Sydney Harbour in 1875, when he was killed in 1875, some 10,000 people lined the roads from, pretty sure it was Milson's Point, all the way up to Crow's Nest to see him off. And what an extraordinary thing. It was evidence of how important the Royal Navy was to the mindset of white Sydney-siders, their sense of well-being, their sense of security on the edge of this vast ocean. And Goodenough had been killed in the Solomon Islands. You might be able to see on that Celtic cross there the word Santa Cruz, which is one of the islands in the Solomon group. And he was there, caught up in the aftermath of an unpleasant blackbirding incident. And he was hit by a poison dart and died of tetanus on the way back, and was buried with much respect and fanfare in 1875, along with some of his sailors. And that monument, which is considerable, and it was there with its own setting, anchors and a chain barrier around it, quite elaborate, is sitting there in St Thomas's Rest Park today, which is a beaut thing, still exists. Some of the monuments don't. But I suspect very few people know anything about it, or can know anything about James Goodenough. There is a Goodenough Island up in New Guinea too, so his name lives on in a sort of a cryptic way. So it was all those wondering about those periods of intense connection, and that idea of an amnesia that, or at least one of the themes I wanted to explore in this book. And the other thing that struck me is that, well, we have a current very intense relationship with the Pacific by way of our modern beach culture, which began at Manly. It's very seldom can you pinpoint a social revolution in a particular place with a particular person, but apparently it was a chap from Vanuatu, then called the New Hebrides, in the 1890s, who taught local guys how to body surf. And from there, the body surfing revolution, which turned into board riding, spread up and down the New South Wales coast within a decade, and overturning those Victorian laws which said you couldn't expose your body between sunrise and sunset. So swimming at beaches was forbidden, essentially, in the daylight. But all that was overturned by power of popular, not so much protest, so just people rolling up to the beach, and the waves were not things to be feared because you drowned and they pounded ships to pieces, but they were things that felt great, and you could ride them. So our modern beach culture is a gift from the Pacific, without a doubt. And there you've got the cover of a souvenir booklet on the left there, which refers to Manly and Warringah, which really are the birthplaces of surfing in Australia, without a doubt, as a Pacific paradise. So there are these sort of other connections which continue on, and I've explored. And there's also intense moments of respect, and not least for the New Guinean men who helped Australian soldiers along the Kokoda Track and elsewhere in New Guinea, sometimes referred to as fuzzy wuzzy angels, which I guess is a respectful term, but is a bit patronising. When I went to New Guinea in 2019, I saw a memorial in Port Moresby to these men, and it was very evident that Papua New Guineans are very proud of their service. It wasn't entirely a happy service, because they were often brutalised and patronised and beaten around the head by the Australian forces, trying to get them to work harder. But for the most part, there's the memory of their assistance during the war against the Japanese in New Guinea is really, really fondly recalled. And this portrait, Ida Healy's one of my favourite artists, extraordinary war artist, who was up there. And this just really demonstrates that respect. There's nothing patronising about that portrait whatsoever. And it's echoed by that portrait there by Greg Seymour, who I think himself is a South Pacific man, but there's resonances then down to the present, because 45% of rugby league players in Australia are of Pacific Island descent, and less than 2% of the population is of Pacific Island descent. So that's a huge discrepancy there. But in the last 10 years at least, possibly a little more, but not too much more, Australians, again, white Australians particularly, become very aware of Pacific Islands by virtue of their impact in sport, and particularly rugby league and rugby union as well. Not least they've been able to pronounce their names, whereas before, I'm sure they would have struggled with that. So there are connections, but they're limited to particular times and particular milieus. So in this case, sport. But one of the things that again that guided my my writing was this ongoing sense of difference. Modern Australia, liberal, democratic, capitalist Australia is very, very different from a lot of the islands and island states in the Southwest Pacific, and indeed from the Asian states in the Northwest Pacific. Japan and China are still very traditional societies in a way that Australia isn't. But that sense of difference is something that guided my research and writing, and it's really evident in these photographs here. There's Pere as it existed in 2019, once visited by Margaret Mead when the community was on a tiny little island there. But they moved their stilt huts to the mainland of Manus. It's just off Manus Island, and it's still really a really simple lifestyle that goes on there. There's a school with hardly any books and no computers. And it's a very traditional lifestyle. Kids out there fishing. That area there is surrounded by a ring of coral, so it's sheltered from the sea. I don't think many fish survive in that lagoon, but those that do have to tend with the kids or are forever fishing. And there's the Mount Hagen Festival, which some of you may have gone to, extraordinary thing, which I went to in 2019, where the Highland tribes get together, and it's really a display for them rather than the tourists. I was one of the relatively few, actually. It surprised me, Western tourists there with their cameras and things gawking, but they're dressing up for themselves and carrying out traditional rituals, which again are very different to modern Australia. There's modern Australia. That's on the shores of Botany Bay. That's where it all began for modern white Australia. And look what we've done. Look at that extraordinary monstrosity. But so I referenced quite a few times in the book towards the end Donald Horne's idea of the lucky country, which is the modern nation of Australia, which is just lucky because it's got all this mineral wealth and all this space, and the wealth hasn't been earned in a sense. And that was an important idea for me, because it really is serendipity that we have so much mineral wealth and the spaces there. It's a huge, vast, ancient land, whereas so many of the nation states, particularly in the South and Mid Pacific, are new. I mean, they've popped up because a seamount has emerged, and one actually popped up literally as I was writing in 2015 near Tonga. So there's a new island. Suddenly it's almost in biblical time. This thing suddenly emerges from the depths, or islands are formed because atolls are created by coral around subsiding seamounts. Whereas Australia's been there. It was part of Gondwana, all those millions of years ago, and drifts up in the last 40 million years to the edge of the Pacific, and is essentially where we are now, about 5 million years ago. You can see on this map that the name Tethys there on the top right. The Pacific didn't even exist at this time. So you need to have Africa departing with South America and forming the Pacific and the Atlantic, and then Australia drifts up. And all those dark grey areas there are coal deposits. So all that vegetation, which is compressed, essentially compressed sunlight, energy from the sun, that's what we've been burning since the get-go as modern Australia, discovered around 1800 near Newcastle, the Coal River. And that's what's made so much of our wealth. And that's, of course, what we're talking about still to this day. So very different to the mineral resources that are available to so many of those Pacific islands. And I'll talk about Nauru in a minute. Now, so when Australia finally arrives at its present location on the southwest rim of the Pacific, the shape of it is not as we know it today. It's a larger lump, which is called Sahul by archaeologists, anthropologists, biologists, and it's joined to New Guinea because, of course, the sea has risen and fallen many times in the tens of thousands of years. So at its lowest levels in that period there, 100,000 to 10,000 years ago, we were joined to New Guinea, and Tasmania was part of that big mainland. And I'm guessing that people arrived in Australia 65, 70,000 years ago up at this top end. You know, they were island hopping across there. They spread throughout the continent over the next 20 to 40,000 years ago. They're down in Tasmania 20,000 years ago. But around 40,000 years ago, there is a distinct difference between the genetic makeup of the people who we know today as New Guineans and Aboriginal Australians, which is interesting. And this must be very mountainous country here. That all crumpled up with a continental plate pushing up against the Pacific plate, the Australian plate there. So that's why New Guinea is so mountainous. And people in some of those valleys, you know, don't know who's living next door to them. So they're very isolated up there, and a whole different culture develops in New Guinea to that which developed in Australia. I mean, many different cultures in Australia, but across Australia there are some commonalities. Now, Australia is sort of linked biologically to the Pacific, not least by birds, which can fly over vast areas of water, of course. That explains why Nauru's got so much phosphate, or had so much phosphate, because of all the birds pooping on there. But you can still see birds like the Japanese snipe and the Pacific plover that fly from one end of the Pacific to the other, still to come to Australia. They must have been doing that for tens of thousands of years. So it really hammers home that the Pacific is not a barrier. It's a highway in many ways, and certainly that for fauna and to some extent flora, particularly as flora is carried by birds. Tim Lowe, the wonderful biologist who wrote about Australian birds in a book, that the name of which escapes me, Where Song Began, I think is what it was called, spoke about Australian birds depositing seeds all through Asia and the Pacific. So, you know, there's this radiation of biota from Australia out to the Pacific too, which is interesting to consider. But just as birds and fish and insects and whatever are blown about the Pacific and go from one land spot to another, so humans did. Now, Aboriginal Australians came to the mainland here 65, 70,000 years ago, and they went no further. They stayed here. They colonised that huge landmass, but they didn't go beyond that. Now, the Austronesians, who are people who have their origins around Taiwan or that area of Asia, they come down, they add to the culture and the genetic makeup of Papua New Guinea, and then spread on to Polynesia. And they do it in craft like this, and they're carrying pigs and chickens, which are, you know, known in Asia. And they colonized Polynesia and all the other islands, New Caledonia, off to Hawaii, all the way across to Easter Island, believe it or not, to about 5,000 years ago. And they inhabit that vast ocean and all the specks of islands within it. They are a seafaring people in the way that Aboriginal people aren't. There's a canoe of Darnley Island. Of this previous one, I've estimated that's about 30 meters long. That's a model, so it's small as an object, but it's based on a canoe that's about 30 meters long. So these really are seafaring vessels that can carry animals and all sorts of things, which is how pigs and chickens and things got to Tahiti and elsewhere. But even when you're heading around the Louisiade archipelago off the southeast corner of southeast end of New Guinea, you know, it's basically seafaring there. And these are large vessels, outriggers. This one's about 7 meters long, from what I can calculate, and they're very different from Aboriginal canoes. Aboriginal people at the top end, where there's some Pacific influence, have outriggers, and there's a dugout on the left-hand side of that. They're bark canoes on the southern end of the continent, so very different from these. But you can see the difference in scale. These aren't seafaring vessels at all. These are for hunting dugong and turtles or whatever, just within the reef. that one from Cairns, but similar around the Torres Strait as well. It's the cultures that develop on the mainland of Australia are very different from those in the Pacific, even within Torres Strait, which some of those islands are only a hop, step and a jump away, but it's remarkable. You may have heard of Bruce Pascoe's book, Dark Emu, where he makes the case that Aboriginal people were agriculturalists. And I really, really disagree with that assessment. I mean, I think he is just arguing along polemical lines because he doesn't like the idea of hunter-gatherers and the hierarchy that Europeans very really did establish between agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers were at the lowest end of the human evolutionary scale, certainly in terms of social evolution. Agriculturalists were there, industrialists, and we go on and on and on. And people haven't been speaking in those terms for the last 40 years. So I really think that book, Dark Emu, muddies the difference between Aboriginal and people and Torres Strait Islanders and other Polynesians, because Aboriginal people didn't have gardens and garden plots in this way, which are so prevalent in New Guinea and the Torres Strait and elsewhere in the Pacific. And indeed, it was that very definite sense of ownership of a particular plot that led Eddie Mabo to pursue his case on Murray Island, a Torres Strait island, and gave him the confidence to do that, whereas Aboriginal people had not been able to argue the case for an attachment to the land. And when the High Court sided with Mabo, they then spread the concept to the rest of Australia. So I argue in the book that, in fact, if surfing is one gift of the Pacific, then native title is another, and it really just offsets that awful foundation myth of terra nullius. But it was because there were very definite garden plots on Murray Island that could be clearly demonstrated and won the day for Eddie and overturned the notion of terra nullius on the mainland. Really significant. Well, the Polynesians were seafarers, extraordinary seafarers, and so were the Europeans. And here's a map just showing the British excursions through the Pacific in the 18th century. Now, there were many Spanish and Portuguese trips before that, and indeed this doesn't even show the French trips in the 1760s. And the point to take away from this is how busy it all was. So very interested in the Pacific and meeting locals in Tahiti and wherever, the friendly islands, throughout, and making assessments on these people and wondering and broadening their understanding. This is European understanding of other peoples, but missing Australia. Australia sits as this vast, great landmass being in a slipstream, as if all the explorers, even Torres, who discovers the Torres Strait but doesn't see or stop on the mainland, everything is missed on the Pacific coast until Cook goes up there, and that's the yellow line here, of course, in 1770. On his next Pacific voyage in 1773, he stops at Norfolk Island and makes note of the extraordinary pine trees there. And it's argued by Geoffrey Blaney that it was the pine trees of Norfolk Island that led to the colonisation, the British settlement of Australia, essentially, because they had a naval function that each tree was seen as a potential mast for a naval ship, and that was the reason. I argue against that, but I lay out those foundation stories there. There's no doubt, however, that Norfolk Island loomed large shortly after Europeans arrived, uninvited, unwelcome, in 1788, and they knew of Norfolk Island because of Cook in 1773, and they sent people off there very soon after in 1789, and it becomes a very interesting and independent and different little offset of the main colony in the vast New South Wales, but around Sydney. Different ways of governing, and while the settlement around Sydney is struggling because the soil is so poor, and Philip's regretting setting up on the harbour. He should have done it up at Parramatta straight away, where the soil's a bit better. On Norfolk Island, the soil being much younger than the old arid sandy soil around Sydney is very lush, and they're growing crops from an early period, and they're rearing pigs. And I argue in my book that in fact it's the success of farming on Norfolk Island which gets Sydney and the larger colony over the line. It's extraordinary. So Blaney missed the point in a way. The significance of Norfolk Island wasn't in that it attracted the British to Australia. I really do believe in the standard story that it's about dumping convicts, but Norfolk Island was very significant in those first two decades. But there are environmental costs, and one of those is this species of petrel, the Norfolk Island petrel, which was one of the birds that I mentioned earlier that migrated all across the Pacific, but for nesting came all the way back, this specific species, all the way back to this tiny place. How they found it, Norfolk Island, Mount Pitt, it's on the northwest side of Norfolk Island, and there they dug burrows, much in the way that mutton birds dig burrows and lay their eggs in there. When the Europeans rolled up in 1789 in March, it coincided with the arrival of the Mount Pitt bird, the petrel, and they just thought, fantastic, until we've got our crops sorted and our pigs breeding, we will eat these. And that's what they did. And they killed them in their tens of thousands. And the Norfolk Island petrel was extinct by 1800. So there's one of our earliest extinctions. Really tragic story, and poignant, because they called it the bird of Providence. How about that? The Providence petrel, because it got them over the line. And when it got them over the line of survival, it then helped the colony. So this bird here, and this is the only picture known of a Mount Pitt bird, they're still in its fluffy down, that survives. Goodness me, what a sort of moral for the unfolding of the rest of history. Well, Sydney has really established itself after, with the help of Norfolk Island, by the early 19th century. And there are ships being built in Sydney Harbour, and colonists, both freed convicts and free merchants who have arrived by the end of the 1790s, have established a significant commercial port, whereas the powers that be back in Whitehall would rather have just remained a convict settlement. It has a momentum of its own. And these people in vessels like some of these are heading off to Tahiti to trade in pork, a huge pork trade with Tahiti, which because the Polynesians had pigs, of course, so they could trade. They weren't trading with Aboriginal people in the same way, because Aboriginal people didn't have that sense of trade in the same way. Yet another difference between Pacific and Aboriginal Australian culture, which meant that, in a sense, that European Australians or colonial Australians could plug into Pacific networks far more easily than they could with Aboriginal Australian networks. So there was more in common with these people who had animals that they recognised, chickens and pigs. They were seafaring. They had hierarchies. They had chiefs and kings that resonated with Europeans in the way that Aboriginal people didn't. And here's one of them. The Maori chief Hongi Hika was befriended by Samuel Marsden, who's got a really bad name in the historical record as a really sadistic preacher, and he was. He beat people within an inch of their life, but he developed a really firm affection for Maori people. He'd given up on the convicts and he'd given up on Aboriginal people, but he really paid a lot of attention to them and was intent on saving their lives. So here, or souls rather, and was back and forth between Sydney and New Zealand. So already there's a relationship with New Zealand established by the first decade of the 19th century. And this chap here, Hongi Hika, comes back and stays on Marsden's sheep farm out past Parramatta and carves this likeness of himself. Clearly he had some skill carving, and he would have been decorating weapons and tools and things, but almost certainly he used a looking glass, a mirror, to do that, and that is a self-representation. So it is so significant in the history of Polynesian art, because this is the self-portrait of a particular man, clearly with all his facial tattoos. And not only is that astonishing, but the thing survived. And it was made from a fence post from Marsden's sheep farm. I mean, it doesn't get more poignant than that. There it was on display. I was lucky to catch it on display at the National Library of Australia, but the item itself is in the Macleay Museum, or what is the new museum up at Sydney University. Don't think it's on display. I suppose you could ask to go into the vaults and have a look at it. The Chow Chak Wing Museum, I think it's called. So there are these early connections with the Southwest Pacific in Australia, very, very early, but they're also trading with China. One of the benefits of delivering convicts to Australia was that the merchants, the ship owners who were hiring out their ships to the government, bringing out the convicts, then pushed off up to China to load up with tea to take it back to England. So they had a load to take back, which made the whole trip quite profitable. And the Australian colonies were already had a developed taste for tea, and so they were trading with China too. Sandalwood was being harvested throughout the Southwest Pacific and taken off to China by Australian colonists. And then by the mid-century, with the discovery of gold, the new gold mountain in Victoria and New South Wales, after the first gold mountain in California, Chinese people start coming down to the colony in numbers, in their tens of thousands. And it's really here that you can see the beginning of white Australia. The antagonism towards Chinese people is not specifically racial. I mean, it's cultural at this time, but it's jealousy. There's a rivalry based in difference, but the authorities are saying we don't want these people here, and they put restrictions on Chinese immigration because of the disorder that follows on the goldfields. It's not until the 1880s, 1890s, and then famously in 1901 that white Australia is really discussed, that white people can only live among white people and there shan't be Asians or black people in Australia. Henry Parkes, just down the road again from where I'm talking now in Walker Street, gave a speech to his local electorate. He was the member for St Leonard's in 1888 to that effect. Never the twain shall meet. We cannot live here with Asian people. They are too different to us. And from there you get white Australia. Well, Chinese people stay. That's the remarkable thing. Despite all that animosity, despite the violence, despite the discrimination, there are tens of thousands of Chinese people still in Australia by the turn of the 20th century and white Australia, and they are here as a proud community, and they've built that silk archway in honour of the Duchess and Duke of Cornwall. Goodness me, not on the main drag where all the other arches are for the opening of Parliament in Melbourne, because they weren't allowed, but they opened it up in their little Chinatown and hoped that the Duke and Duchess would see it. So isn't that amazing? There are still many Chinese people here in Australia who can trace their ancestry back to the 19th century, that they are Australian no less than anyone else, but they were marginalised Australians for all that time. And you only need look into the history of small communities and families to see the impact, therefore, of Asia Pacific, Northwest Pacific on Australian culture. As overwhelmingly Anglo-Celtic as it was, the Chinese were still very significant and resilient. Now, you've got the Japanese also coming down for the pearl shell industry. Very multicultural up there in Torres Strait by the end of the 19th century. Here they are, not looking for pearls, but looking for the pearl shell, because that's used for buttons, of course. So that was tens of thousands of pounds worth of exports every year. So much so that the easy pickings, the shallow pearl shell was fished out by the 1870s, and they're having to import those breathing suits, those things with the great big helmets. And I'm not sure whether you can see those shoes there. These are weighted shoes to help keep people on the sea floor as they're fishing around. This is resource extraction on an industrial scale. Now, that's something that Europeans do bring to the Pacific, and it's very, very different. There's a whole new economy and a whole different way of thinking about the environment when Europeans roll up. So these resources are depleted. they're called resource raiders, in some terminology, but depleted in various parts of the Torres Strait by the turn of the century. But the fishery continues on till the 1950s, until it's made redundant by the introduction of plastic buttons. There's still some pearl shell extraction going on, but it's very regulated. But it's a very multicultural industry, and it's employing Torres Strait Islanders and some Aboriginal people too, always, however, with European supervisors and owners. Now, resource extraction in the Pacific brings us to blackbirding, which has been in the news fairly recently, at least in North Sydney, because of the survey about renaming Ben Boyd Road. Ben Boyd, who set up his business in Neutral Bay, not far again from where I'm sitting. It's funny how the local can be global in so many ways. He was the guy who pioneered blackbirding, which is getting cheap labour from the Pacific. In his case, the New Hebrides, present-day Vanuatu, just ripping these people off. It's indentured labour. It's not chattel slavery. So these people aren't owned in the way that slaves in America were owned, but they're really mistreated, they're coerced, they're duped, and it's unregulated through properly until the 1890s. So here's a chap from somewhere in the South Sea Islands. I mean, he can't have known where he was going and why he was going there until he ended up on a sugar plantation. But people are there long enough to establish communities in northern Queensland, so much so that some 60,000 people today in Australia trace their heritage back to South Sea Islanders who were blackbirded between 1860, not including Boyd's ventures in the 1840s, but Robert Towns and others were bringing people over first for sugar and then first for cotton, and then for sugar from the 1860s right through to 1900, 1901. And then they weren't welcome because it's white Australia, of course. So these people have become Christian, and they're getting married amongst each other, and they've got their own communities in far north Queensland. And then a lot of them are just turfed out after white Australia is declared. So that really is, shameful. Now, I found it very interesting to look through newspapers at the time and expected to find lots of cheering. Yes, get the black people out because they're cheap labour and they're undermining wages for white people. There were certainly arguments like that, particularly in the labour movement. But I was amazed by how many people also argued against the deportation of South Sea Islanders on the basis that it was just a lousy thing to do. That is not how civilized nations act, literally was what was said in one of the Queensland newspapers. So it was a revelation to me for all the exploitation that happened in the 19th century and well into the 20th century by white Australians who had the advantage of power and money, firearms and all the rest of it to impose their will upon many of these islands. There were people arguing against all of those acts from the very get-go, and it's interesting to see that counter-narrative. And I've made an attempt to sort of include those voices. Burns Philp was the major Australian shipping line which helped the projection of Australian economic power throughout the close Southwest Pacific. And there's a letterhead that I discovered in the State Library, in the Mitchell Library, for an expedition to New Guinea, no less, in 1887. There was one in 1883, as early as that. Australians were very aware of New Guinea, white Australians, Queenslanders not least. They'd already annexed the Torres Strait Islands without any permission from Whitehall. McElwraith, the Premier, just went up and took all the Torres Strait Islands through the 1870s. I mean, a colony colonising other places, just extraordinary. And he ran up a British flag on a flagpole in New Guinea at a mission station there too in the 1880s. And the Brits were really unimpressed. But the white colonists just kept whining about threats from Germans and elsewhere and saying, the Brits, you have to annex New Guinea. And they eventually did in the 1880s. And it becomes British New Guinea, and there's German New Guinea. And then British New Guinea is Papua. And then that's handed over to Australia, newly formed Australia in 1901. And then after the First World War, Australia also gets the territory of German New Guinea. So Australia becomes a colonizer. This is often how Pacific Island cultures are depicted, both for good and bad. This is from a book by two missionaries, James Chalmer and W. Wyatt Gill. This is why missionary intervention is needed in the Pacific, because these people are always killing each other. But it's also used as an argument for those who want to exploit resources. These people are just chaotic, and if we don't get in there and find the gold and do all the rest, then it'll go to waste. So this argument that Pacific Islanders don't know how to govern themselves was used for both those who wanted to protect them and those who wanted to exploit them. And Australia is there projecting itself by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, very much so in the Southwest Pacific, as you can see, but also maintaining strong links here to Japan and China, despite the White Australia policy. There is a strong trade going on there, and then of course all the way across to North America. I found that very interesting too. I've just acquired for this collection here at Stanton Library a little set of Netsuke, those beautiful carved little figurines, which were bought from Japan by a P&O engineer who built a house for himself and his family in Camaray, 1913, and they were pride of place on the mantelpiece, and it was a deceased estate last year, and we got them for our collection. So there's that early cultural link to Asia in White Australia. Fascinating. Australia, the White Australians were worried about the Germans, and then they get a chance to kick them out in the First World War, and they were keen to do so. So before even the Anzacs were formed, there's the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force heading up to New Guinea to kick the Germans out, which they did very effectively straight up in August 1914. And afterwards, as I said, German New Guinea, which is the northern part of the Big Island, and also New Britain, Rabaul, that passes into Australian hands as a mandated territory. And Hubert Murray is the governor of Papua on the southern side of the Big Island, and he governs with a sort of it's paternal empathy is the best way to put it. I think he was very aware that these people weren't just childlike idiots, as was portrayed in some of the writings, but he nonetheless had a lot of trouble governing, because this is a land where it's just 800 languages spread across mountains and valleys and coasts and bays, and they're trying to impose a single government on top of it. His writings are really worth mentioning. He tried to govern with the help of an anthropologist. Anthropology was a new science, for want of a better term, at the time, trying to understand these other people, understanding by way of finding out a way to govern them. And F.E. Williams was his government anthropologist. There was a government anthropologist also in the territory of New Guinea, the mandated territory, and that was Ernest Chinnery, and his wife Sarah took many photographs. There's Rabaul, which was a town essentially built by the Germans, apparently a very beautiful town. I went to Rabaul, and it was not very beautiful, because beautiful old Rabaul had been destroyed by an earthquake, a volcanic eruption in the 1990s. But this is Chinatown in Rabaul. The Chinese were still there in force, whereas they weren't welcome in the colony of New Guinea. And there's the Chinnery's house star. What developed in New Britain, or in the territory of New Guinea, even more so than Papua, was almost like an apartheid, where whites lived separately apart from their house servants from blacks, and blacks had to stand up when whites entered. Really quite alarming, a parallel type of society to what was going on in South Africa in many ways. Better move along quickly. What are we up to? Oh, already 1:45. The war looms large, as it must do in my book. I'm going to move through these photographs here. There again is a Papuan man helping an Australian. What I found interesting, however, was instances like this of Australians helping the Japanese. And I spoke earlier about difference. And modern Australia, for all the racism of white Australia, nonetheless was a liberal democracy with a keen sense of individual dignity, both derived from the Enlightenment and from Christianity. And therefore, there weren't so many atrocities conducted by Australian troops on Japanese compared to the other way around, where it was a warrior code that dictated that you vanquish your opponents and humiliate them. And I just found that a very poignant photograph, because the reverse wouldn't be the case. You know, that Australian guy would have been bayoneted had he been captured. I spoke about Ivor Healy earlier. You know, that war in New Guinea was such a formative experience. So many people have connections to it to this day, by great uncles and grandfathers and all the rest of it. Australians didn't know how to fight at the beginning of the war. They were dressed in the wrong gear, sandy coloured khaki. By the end of that Kokoda campaign, and then the campaigns that followed that, they were pardoned veterans. And this oil painting by Ivor Healy just shows them as almost melting in and being part of the jungle. Yeah. So the Second World War is fought and won, and Japan becomes an ally, because there's another war, a Cold War, that develops after that. That becomes a hot war in Korea, and Australia again is involved in that. It's a United Nations action in 1950, but the idea of a yellow peril, you know, this threat from the north, which is essentially a threat from the Pacific, but the Northwest Pacific, people sometimes make a distinction, which is not helpful, between Asia and the Pacific, but Asia has a Pacific coast, you know, and therefore Australia has an Asian Pacific connection and a Southwest Pacific connection. So, and I've tried to incorporate those in my study here. But as much as there was a fear of communism, there was a fear of the yellow peril. So Australians were up for that fight in a United Nations sanctioned conflict, because it was the North that invaded the South in Korea without a doubt. But we were really up for the fight that followed in Vietnam. In fact, we almost elbowed our way in and told the Americans that we want to be part of this, for all the same reasons. Again, you know, yellow peril mixed with the domino theory of Dulles. So Menzies was very keen to get involved in that stoush there, with all the legacies that followed from there. Not least is our first migration crisis, which the boat people from Vietnam is really interesting to look back on, because for all the racism and hostility with which many of them were confronted with in Australia, they were also welcomed. And because Malcolm Fraser was the Prime Minister, and he had been the Minister for the Army during the Vietnam War, and he was very aware that these were the people who were our allies, and we needed to extend open arms to them. So his was an extraordinarily enlightened immigration policy, I think, and these people were essentially welcomed, as whether they came as boat people or whether they came via refugee camps in Thailand or wherever. Very different to what happened later. I'm running out of time very quickly. I'm going to move forward past there, and here's the counter narrative to that. You know, when there's immigration in the early, there's asylum seeking in the early 2000s, 2001, particularly with the Tampa. These asylum seekers are not welcome at all. We will determine who comes here in the circumstances in which they come, and we've got offshore processing as the ultimate deterrent. So they're on Nauru. Nauru by this stage has no phosphate to sell largely, and so they make money by hosting our unwanted asylum seekers, 70% of whom were declared valid refugees, but at least between up to 2008. So it's not like they're all economic refugees. But this drama was still unfolding as I was writing the book. You know, it's vanished from our television screens and news feeds now. There are still people on Nauru and Papua and New Guinea, but it was right there. So I found myself writing history as history was unfolded with the asylum seeking issue, but even more so with climate change. And I'll finish up now. And that is clearly a debate that we're still having. I've been surprised at how it's been taken up with the COP conference and how much coverage there has been, because I really thought COVID was going to overshadow everything for many years, but it's there in the lead up to the next election. And I write quite passionately because I really think it's a pretty well a black and white issue that Australia has been dragging the chain on climate change and transitioning from carbon-based resources for too long, and have been doing so despite what the local Pacific Island community and those who still live in the Pacific have been telling us. The science has been known for well over a decade. It's been certain, and the pushback from Abbott and Morrison, I personally think is disgraceful. I went to that rally in 2015, and the Pacific Islander community were there in force, so they knew all about it, and that's how many years ago now? 6 years ago. And so we're having that debate now. I better leave it there because we're already at 5 minutes to, and some people may have some questions. So that's essentially the book in a nutshell about that. But it'd be good if you did read it, and you can buy it at all good bookshops, or you can borrow it from Stanton Library. So I'll finish there.